an inevitable end. The city that had once been the proud heart of the Third Reich now resembled a dissected corpse. The grand boulevards, once echoing with parades, were now cratered by bombs. Burned-out tanks lay scattered like the carcasses of giant beasts slain in the street. Iconic buildings of power, ministries, theaters, train stations, were indistinguishable from ordinary housing blocks. All shared the same ashen gray, total devastation. The air in Berlin was thick with the scent of a war in its final stage. The acrid stench of gunpowder that never cleared, broken brick, burning oil, and a smell that defied naming, the stench of prolonged fear. The air raid sirens no longer caused panic. They had become a familiar, almost meaningless sound, like a clock ticking away time in a city awaiting death. Underground, Berlin survived in narrow, suffocating basements, thousands, then tens of thousands crammed together in darkness. Children no longer cried much, they were too exhausted. The elderly sat motionless, eyes empty. Women whispered rumors from the east. The Red Army was coming, faster than anyone had predicted. No one spoke aloud. No one dared to talk about tomorrow. In Berlin at that moment, the future was a luxury no one could afford. Above ground, the city no longer operated by any kind of urban logic. There was no traffic, no commerce, no rhythm of daily life. Only small groups of people wandering aimlessly, searching for water, for food, for a solid enough wall to sleep against through the night. Corpses lay on sidewalks, in parks, in bomb craters. Not because Berliners had grown numb, but because no one had the strength to bury the dead anymore. Death had become too frequent, too constant. It was part of the landscape. Meanwhile, on military maps, Berlin was being encircled by the hour. From the east, the red arrows of the Red Army advanced relentlessly. From the north and south, Soviet army groups tightened the noose. For the officers still sane enough to read a map without lying to themselves, the question of whether Berlin would fall had already lost meaning. Only two questions remained: when and how many more lives would be lost for something that could no longer be changed. The collapse of Berlin didn't come in a single explosive moment. It came through a slow draining of belief. Each passing day peeled away another layer of illusion. The victorious broadcasts on the radio grew shorter, more hollow. The slogans about the Führer's will still hung on cracked walls, looking more like curses than motivation. In the command centers, mid-ranking officers began to realize they were actors in a play with a predetermined ending. Orders were still issued, reports were still filed, but behind the stiff formulaic words was a truth everyone could feel. There was no force left strong enough to defend this city. And yet, Berlin was not yet the final battlefield. Before the storm truly hit the city's heart, there remained one final barrier, the last line between Berlin and total destruction. One name came up in every meeting, every order, every self-reassuring whisper: Oder. To Hitler, the Oder River was not just a river. It was the symbol of last hope, a defensive line that could somehow reverse fate. On the map, Oder looked promising. A wide river, high western banks, perfect for a layered defense. In the Führer's imagination, this was where the Red Army would be stopped, worn down, then driven back by one final counterattack. But in Berlin, those who truly understood war knew the Oder was no miracle. Reports from the front no longer predicted outcomes. They read like obituaries. The defenders had too few troops, too little equipment, and not enough time to dig real fortifications. What was called a defensive line was in truth just patchwork, makeshift repairs on a fabric already torn to shreds. In hushed, unrecorded conversations, officers began to whisper what no one dared to say aloud. If the Oder fell, Berlin would be completely exposed. There was no second line, no real reserves, just the city, and the civilians trapped inside it. And then the distant artillery began to grow louder. It was no longer the faint sound of battles at the front. It was a countdown. Every explosion was another step forward for the Red Army, another step backward for every illusion. Berlin now was like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down and knowing the fall was certain. The only question left was, where would the fall begin? The answer lay to the east, where the Oder River waited, not as a fortress, but as the last fragile curtain shielding a dying capital. And once that curtain was torn apart, everything that followed would be the inevitable consequence of an illusion that had lasted far too long. Oder was not a place you felt with your eyes. It was felt through desperate faith. To Hitler and those still clinging to the fantasy of one last turning point, that river represented a sacred boundary. To the east, chaos. To the west, Berlin, the heart that must be defended at all costs. On the maps hanging in command rooms, the Oder appeared as a clean, solid curve, a line that could stop the flood of history. But war doesn't happen on paper, and the real Oder looked nothing like the version conjured in the Führer's imagination. The German soldiers sent to hold the line didn't march into battle with the spirit of a force defending the gates of the capital. They arrived with the feeling of men already left behind. Many units existed only in name. Troop numbers were patched together, equipment was mismatched, commanders changed constantly. Some platoons were reinforced with boys who hadn't even grown a full beard, their hands trembling as they held outdated rifles pulled from storage since the last World War. Other units were made up entirely of middle-aged men, tired eyes belonging to men who had once been mechanics, teachers, postal workers, now stuffed into ill-fitting uniforms, a bitter reminder that no longer belonged on this battlefield. Oder was called a defensive line, but in truth it was a scattered chain of half-finished positions. The fortifications were shallow and hastily dug, with no real coordination. The anti-tank ditches were incomplete. Minefields were too shallow. Everything reflected a truth no one wanted to say aloud. Germany was out of time. There were no more days, no more weeks to turn this river into a real fortress. The only thing left was hope. Hope that the enemy might hesitate, that some miracle might happen. But that miracle never came. At dawn on April 16, 1945, the eastern sky above the Oder lit up in a way no German soldier had ever seen. It wasn't sunrise, it was fire. Thousands of Soviet artillery guns opened fire at once, unleashing an earthquake that lasted for hours. The ground shook as if it too wanted to flee. The air was torn apart by the howling of shells, explosions layered upon explosions, until the human ear could no longer tell one sound from another. In the choking smoke, German soldiers crouched in their bunkers and waited. But they weren't waiting to counterattack. They were waiting to survive each minute. When the shelling finally stopped, they knew what was coming next. And it came. From the east, waves of steel began to move. Soviet tanks surged across the Oder like an unstoppable flood. Artillery kept firing, infantry followed closely behind, giving the Germans no time to regroup, no time even to understand what was happening. The German resistance, if it can be called that, unfolded in fragments and desperation. Some fought to the last bullet. Others broke and ran at the first glimpse of tanks emerging from the fog. Not out of cowardice, but because the survival instinct had drowned out all slogans. A defensive line built on illusions could not stand against the reality of firepower and of men. Within days, the Oder was no longer a line of defense. It was a memory. Reports flooded back to Berlin, each one worse than the last. One army group breached, another retreating in chaos. Positions marked holding strong on the map no longer existed. But in the underground meeting rooms, counterattack arrows were still being drawn, as if a line of ink could change reality. The fall of the Oder didn't come with a sudden shock. It came as a brutal confirmation. Those who understood war knew, if this line failed, Berlin was open. No more buffers, no more time to delay. The war was no longer a matter of strategy, it was a matter of ending. But something even more terrifying loomed beyond the tactical collapse. The question arose, even if the Oder had held for a few more days, a few more weeks, then what? With what would they keep fighting? And with whom? These questions began to creep into the minds of generals and staff officers, those still clear-headed enough to look beyond the map. They began to realize that Germany's problem wasn't just the loss of a line of defense, it was that the entire war machine had rotted from the inside. Oder was just the surface, the shallow skin of a much deeper crisis. News from the rear was growing darker. Rail lines cut, fuel depots empty, ammunition rationed in drops, prioritized for battles labeled decisive, though everyone knew there were no decisive battles left. The remaining tanks weren't being destroyed by enemy fire. They were being abandoned on roadsides because there was no fuel to move them. In that context, the fall of the Oder wasn't just the defeat of a front. It was the moment the curtain was pulled back. It revealed the truth. Germany no longer had a real army. only fragments of what had once been a mighty force, now held together by orders and fear. And as the soldiers retreated westward, as the distance from the Oder to Berlin shrank by the day, that truth could no longer be hidden. Not in the official reports, but in the eyes of those passing each other along the roads. Eyes that understood. There was no more fuel to flee, no more bullets to fire, and no words left that could cover up reality. From the ashes of the Oder line, a heavier, deeper question began to take shape in the command rooms. If the army is this exhausted, what meaning is left in any further order? And that truth, sooner or later, would find its way to the one place it had been forbidden to reach, the center of power, where final decisions were still being made, as if the war could somehow go on. When the Oder line collapsed, what remained of the German army was not a force in orderly retreat, but a body drained of all life. Defeat by this point no longer took the shape of red arrows on a map or the dry language of tactical reports. It became real, painfully real, in the smallest, grimmest details of military life. A tank sitting dead in the middle of the road with not a drop of fuel in its tank, an abandoned artillery gun left behind because there were no shells to fire, a platoon disbanded because no officer remained alive to command it. By April 1945, the German army was no longer a functioning instrument of war. It was a system in complete paralysis. The synthetic fuel plants, once the pride of Germany's war industry, had been destroyed months earlier by Allied air raids. The few fuel trains that still departed couldn't reach their destinations because the railway network had been shattered. On paper, the divisions still existed. In reality, many of them were nothing but names. Fuel became a constant obsession. Low-level commanders were forced to make decisions that defied every principle of conventional military logic, blowing up their own tanks to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, or abandoning fully intact combat vehicles simply because there was no gasoline to move them. In some places, once famous Panzer tanks were turned into immobile bunkers, standing still like iron statues, waiting to be destroyed. The era of mechanized warfare, once Germany's pride, ended in bitter stillness. Ammunition was no better. Urban combat consumed massive quantities of bullets, but the supply depots were nearly empty. Defensive units in Berlin and its surroundings were handed small boxes of ammo, with strict orders to conserve at all costs. In that context, conserve meant making choices, choosing who got to shoot and who had to die without firing back. Some soldiers kept a final bullet not for the enemy, but for themselves, in case they were surrounded. The breakdown in logistics didn't just weaken combat capabilities, it destroyed morale. German soldiers were used to iron discipline and tightly structured organization. When that system crumbled, what remained was confusion. Orders were still issued, but no one believed those orders had anything to do with reality. Uniforms were still worn, but the sense of belonging to a purposeful army was gone. The clearest tragedy of this collapse unfolded in the Halbe Forest, where the Ninth Army was encircled. The reports from there read less like military dispatches and more like pages torn from a desperate diary. Units lost contact with each other. Wounded soldiers lay scattered in the woods with no medicine and no help. Men starving, dehydrated, exhausted, trying in vain to break through enemy lines. They didn't die in epic battles. They died slowly, quietly, in chaos and despair. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the command rooms were still lit, maps still unfurled, counterattack arrows were still drawn. But the gap between what was drawn on paper and what was happening in the field was growing wider by the day. And in that widening gap, the truth became the most dangerous thing of all. Generals and staff officers understood that the problem was no longer one of tactics or strategy. There were no options left to turn the tide. The material foundation of war had already collapsed. No fuel meant no mobility. No ammunition meant no defense. No logistics meant every order was an empty phrase. The war had passed the point where willpower or loyalty could make up the difference. But to speak that truth aloud was not a simple matter. In the system Hitler had created, truth was not data to be analyzed. It was a threat to be eliminated. After the failed assassination attempt on July 20th, 1944, fear had engulfed the entire command structure. Generals who once dared to argue had learned to fall silent. Reports that once reflected reality were now carefully written to match the Führer's expectations. And so, while the army at the front was bleeding out by the hour, a different world existed at the center of the Third Reich's power. There, units that had been destroyed were still listed as operational. Forces with no fuel were still being assigned counterattack missions. Names on the map outlived the men they represented. The truth was pushed aside, blurred, distorted, not because anyone believed it would vanish, but because everyone knew the cost of speaking it. Telling the truth meant placing yourself on the list of traitors. And in the final months of the Reich, treason wasn't just punished by death, it was punished by public disgrace and the destruction of entire families. Yet by late April, the truth had grown too large to bury. Casualty numbers, broken communication lines, supply requests that were never fulfilled, all of it mounted into unbearable pressure on those still holding positions of command. They knew. With each day of silence, thousands more were dying for nothing. And then, the truth began to find its way through. Not in official meetings, but in narrow hallways, whispered conversations, silent glances exchanged between men who had been avoiding this moment for months. The generals began to steel themselves for what they had long refused to face: a direct confrontation with Hitler, armed only with the raw, inescapable reality. That path, the path to that confrontation, was not just a physical one. It was psychological. It stretched from the front lines where fuel and ammunition had run out, through the distorted reports, deep into the heart of Berlin, beneath layers of concrete where power still sought refuge from the outside world. There, in a sealed space, cut off from sunlight and from the pulse of reality, existed a place where truth was treated as the most dangerous enemy. A place where every word had to be weighed, not just for meaning, but for the survival of the one speaking it. And in that place, what remained of reason would finally be forced to face a system built far too long on illusion. That place was the Führerbunker, the final crossroads where unflinching truth collided with power that refused to be challenged. The Führerbunker was unlike any military command center that had ever existed. It wasn't built to manage a war. It was built to isolate power from reality. Buried deep beneath Berlin, encased in thick layers of concrete and reinforced steel, the bunker resembled a giant cocoon, a place where the outside world was distorted, blurred, and eventually erased altogether from the awareness of those inside. The air in the bunker was always damp and heavy. Dim yellow lights cast a sickly glow over the narrow hallways, giving every face a weary gray pallor. The sound of artillery from above drifted down inconsistently, sometimes faint, sometimes near, like the irregular heartbeat of a body in its final throes. But rather than serving as a reminder that Berlin was falling, the noise eventually became background static, something familiar, accepted, and ultimately ignored. Here, reality wasn't measured by what was happening outside, but by what Adolf Hitler was willing to hear. Every report, every sentence, every glance had to be filtered before approaching the center of power. Truth didn't disappear. It was bent, trimmed, softened until it no longer posed a threat to the illusion that sustained the entire system. After the failed assassination attempt on July 20, 1944, the Führerbunker became a space ruled by fear. The piano wires used to hang traitorous generals didn't just kill men, they killed the habit of speaking the truth. From that point on, no one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. No one wanted to become living proof that the truth could lead straight to death. Inside the bunker, Hitler lived on a different timeline. While above ground, neighborhood after neighborhood of Berlin fell, inside the bunker, counterattack plans were still being discussed, as if the German army were still intact. The names of shattered divisions still appeared on the maps. Brightly colored arrows were still drawn, layered over one another, forming a maze of tactics that bore no resemblance to the ground above, now littered with wrecked tanks and corpses. Meetings in the bunker took on a surreal atmosphere. No one raised their voice. No one dared to argue. Every word was chosen with care, as if a single misstep could trigger an uncontrollable explosion of rage. Hitler listened, but not to understand. He listened to seek confirmation of what he already believed. Any information that contradicted that belief was dismissed, or worse, treated as a betrayal. The truth was not lacking in the Führerbunker. What was missing was permission for that truth to exist in its full form. Reports from the front were filtered multiple times before reaching Hitler. Casualty figures were rounded down, softened, delayed. Defeats were described in vague terms like tactical withdrawal or realignment of the front. Language became a shield, protecting power from reality itself. In that confined space, denial became the default condition. Hitler wasn't just denying defeat, he was denying the basic logic of modern warfare. When told there was no more fuel, he spoke of willpower. When told there was no more ammunition, he spoke of fighting spirit. When warned that some units no longer existed, he named reserve forces that had never existed outside his imagination. Those around him understood this. They knew the Führerbunker was not a place to correct mistakes. It was a place to prolong the illusion. But that prolonging came with a cruel paradox. The longer the truth was hidden, the higher the cost outside. Each order born from delusion was paid for in blood and bodies on the streets of Berlin. And though no one said it aloud, invisible cracks began to form within the bunker, not in the concrete, but in the minds of its occupants. There were silent glances exchanged, pauses that lingered too long in meetings, reports held back for a few more minutes before being delivered. These were the signs of people caught between survival instinct and historical responsibility. The Führerbunker became, in that sense, a psychological prison. It imprisoned Hitler within his own world, and imprisoned those around him in the fear of speaking the truth. But the paradox was this: the deeper they burrowed into the bunker, the harder it became to deny the world outside. The artillery drew closer. Reports of lost districts grew heavier, and even in a space designed to block out reality, reality began to seep in. By the end of April, the truth was no longer a set of data that could be adjusted. It was a weight pressing down on everyone. There was no way left to conceal that the army had collapsed logistically, no way to justify orders that could no longer be carried out. The Führerbunker had become not just a place where truth was forbidden, but a place where truth was now ready to explode. In that context, a certain group of people began to emerge, unwilling witnesses to reality. They weren't rebels. They weren't defiant heroes. They were officers, generals, men who had lived their whole lives inside the system, had believed in it, served it, and were now forced to confront a conclusion they could no longer avoid. The war was lost. They knew exactly what was happening beyond the bunker walls. They read the unfiltered reports. They received the final desperate transmissions from collapsing front lines. They understood that every silent hour meant thousands more dying for nothing. And because they understood that, they became the most dangerous men in the eyes of a regime that could not tolerate the existence of truth. In the narrow corridors of the Führerbunker, under the dim lights and the distant rumble of artillery, these men began to recognize their role, not as saviors of the war, but as keepers of the final truth. And from that moment, the story was no longer about Hitler. It was about those who stood beside him, those who knew the truth and had to decide whether they dared bring it into the light. In those final days, at the heart of a dying Berlin, there was a group of men who could no longer lie to themselves. They didn't form an opposition. They didn't plot a coup. They didn't resemble rebels. They were simply men who had gone too far into the war to keep believing the lies. Men who knew the truth and carried it like a burden they could never put down. Heinz Guderian was one of them. Once hailed as the father of Germany's armored warfare, he now resembled a shadow of his former self. His body was exhausted, his spirit worn down by the collapse of what he had helped create. Guderian understood war in numbers, logistics, and mobility. And because he understood, he knew the war had been lost long ago. No one had yet dared say it aloud. In meetings inside the Führerbunker, he had tried again and again to pull Hitler back toward reality, not with emotion, but with data. But data, in that place, was not welcome. Beside him was Gotthard Heinrici, one of the finest defensive commanders left in the German army. He didn't speak often, but when he did, he spoke plainly. His reports were not sugar-coated, not softened, not disguised. That made him dangerous. Heinrici knew the Oder line couldn't hold. He knew every promise of a counterattack was self-deception. But he also knew the price of speaking the truth inside a system where truth had become a form of betrayal. Then there was Hans Krebs, the messenger. the man tasked with bringing grim reports from the front into the depths of the bunker. Krebs lived in a state of constant inner conflict. He wasn't a dreamer, but neither was he hard enough to sever ties with the system he had served all his life. Every report he submitted was a dangerous balancing act between honesty and survival. Say too much, and he could die. Say too little, and thousands more would. And then Alfred Jodl, the architect of operational orders. Jodl was the one who took Hitler's scattered paranoid thoughts and turned them into official documents. He signed orders he knew couldn't be carried out, not because he believed in them, but because the system required belief. Each signature was an act of self-persuasion, a way to convince himself that order still existed, that discipline still meant something, even as the reality outside had collapsed. And quietly, always in the background like a shadow trailing power, was Wilhelm Burgdorf. He wasn't a strategist. He didn't fight battles. His role was oversight, ensuring no one crossed the ideological line. His presence in the meetings was a silent reminder. Telling the truth could cost not just your life, but the lives of your family. These men didn't meet under bright lights or in official sessions. They saw each other in brief glances, narrow corridors, unrecorded rooms, short conversations in low voices, sometimes only a look. They didn't need to speak much. They all knew what the others were thinking. The army had collapsed. Logistics were gone. Berlin could not be defended for long. The war wasn't lost in spirit. It was lost in fact. News from the Halbe forest was the breaking point. An entire army group encircled, wiped out in chaos. No ammo, no medicine, no escape. Men dying slowly in the woods, while on the bunker's map, they were still shown as a breakthrough force. The gap between paper and blood had become unbearable. At that point, the question was no longer, should we speak? It was, if we don't speak, are we still human? For these generals, silence was no longer obedience. It was complicity. Every hour spent in silence meant more units thrown into slaughter for orders with no grounding in reality. But choosing to speak the truth was never a dramatic moment. It didn't arrive with heroism. It came with fear, sleepless nights, and averted gazes. They knew exactly what awaited them if they crossed that final line. The history of the Third Reich had offered more than enough examples of what happened to those who disobeyed. And yet, as the shelling drew closer, as Berlin's map was eaten away piece by piece, as the fiction of a functioning army could no longer be sustained, the truth forced its way out. Not because courage suddenly appeared, but because there was no other choice left. A meeting was arranged, not officially labeled as a confession of defeat. On paper, it was still a situation report, but everyone who entered that room understood this was no ordinary meeting. This was the final line between illusion and reality, between continuing a blood-soaked play and finally naming the end that had already arrived. They brought documents, numbers, unedited reports, not to argue, but to do something this system had forbidden for too long, to speak the truth, plainly. No one knew who would speak first. Perhaps it would be Guderian, too exhausted for pretense. Perhaps someone else pushed to the edge. Only one thing was certain. When the door closed, when Hitler sat waiting for good news, those who knew the truth understood that they were entering the most dangerous moment of their lives. A night where words could kill them, or free them from the weight of silence. A night history would remember, not for victory, but for the rare, fragile moment when truth was spoken inside a system built entirely on lies. And from that moment forward, the story entered its darkest chapter. The night they looked Hitler in the eye and spoke the ultimate forbidden truth. This war had been lost long ago. That night, no one looked at a clock, but everyone could feel time shrinking. Inside the Führerbunker, the air was so heavy that every breath felt like it had to be dragged from the lungs. The artillery from East Berlin echoed down steadily, deep and low, like a funeral drumbeat for a city not yet dead, but already condemned. The meeting room was narrow, the ceiling low, pale yellow light casting a sickly glow on the map. A surface now drowning in red and blue arrows tangled so tightly, it was impossible to tell where planning ended and delusion began. Hitler sat there in his usual seat, shoulders hunched, hands trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it. He waited. Not for the truth, but for something that could sustain the belief that he was still in control. In his mental world, all it took was one hopeful report. one promise of a counterattack, one unit name spoken with certainty, and the war could survive one more day. Silence stretched, not the polite silence of a typical military briefing, but a suffocating stillness, thick with fear. Everyone in the room knew this moment couldn't last forever. Someone had to speak, and once they did, there would be no way back. At last, a voice rose. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear and merciless. No softening, no euphemisms. The Oder line had collapsed. The units had lost all capacity for organized counterattack. Actual troop strength was only a fraction of what existed on paper. Supplies had run dry. No remaining force could change the outcome. In the first moment, Hitler said nothing. He stared at the map as if searching for some detail that could disprove what had just been said. Then the fury erupted. He slammed his hand on the table. His voice shot up, shrill, broken. Betrayal, cowardice, lack of faith. The familiar words flew like weapons, not at an enemy, but at the very people who had served him for years. But something was different that night. For the first time in a very long while, the men across from him did not step back. They didn't argue. They didn't plead. They simply placed folders on the table. Reports, unedited. Casualty figures, fuel levels, lists of disbanded units. The paper didn't shake. The signatures were still clear. The truth was laid out not as opinion, but as sentence. Hitler flipped through the pages, quickly at first, then slower. He searched for an error, something to seize on and refute. But the numbers were fearless. They stood there, cold, unwavering, unarguable. This was not a local defeat, not a temporary setback. The entire war machine had come to a stop. And then, in a moment no one would ever be able to fully describe, someone finally said the unspeakable. No explanation, no commentary, just a single flat sentence, heavy as a stone hitting concrete. The war is lost. Time seemed to stop. No one moved, no one dared breathe. It wasn't just a sentence. It was the final fracture in a wall of illusion that had stood for over a decade. In that instant, everything the Third Reich had been built upon, absolute belief, blind obedience, the myth of willpower, began to crack. Hitler sank into his chair, not physically, but spiritually. He muttered something to himself. Then, almost instantly, the familiar reflexes kicked in. Denial. Counterattack. Willpower. Names spilled from his mouth like incantations. Steiner will strike from the north. Wen will break through. The remaining units will turn the tide. The men around the table knew they were witnessing a pure tragedy. Not the downfall of a man, but the collapse of an entire system. Hitler was no longer arguing with reality. He was trying to override it with words. And words in that room had lost all power to shape action. No one contradicted him further. No one had the energy to argue. They had said what needed to be said. The rest was no longer in their hands. The meeting ended not with a decision, but with a quiet unraveling. Each man left the room feeling he had crossed an invisible boundary. They were still alive, but the world they once believed in was not. After that night, the Führerbunker entered a strange state. There were no more fierce debates, no more grand illusions spoken aloud, only a steady rhythm of orders. Mechanical, routine, as if the machine were still functioning. But everyone knew, this was just momentum. All of those orders shared a common trait. They could not be carried out. The units assigned to counterattack no longer existed. The lines they were told to hold had already fallen. The plans signed inside the bunker never made it beyond the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin. And from that moment on, when the truth had finally been spoken but not accepted, a new phase began, the phase of commands given to ghost armies, a phase where the war was no longer guided by strategy or reality, but by fear of the end. What followed was no longer warfare, but a tragic performance. Papers continued to move, signatures continued to appear, while outside, all capacity for action had completely vanished. After the night the truth was spoken, the war did not end. It merely shifted into another form, a form in which orders continued to be issued, even though no one truly believed they could be carried out. Inside the Führerbunker, the machinery of power kept turning on inertia alone, like an engine that had burned through all its fuel, but whose wheels kept spinning a few more times from leftover momentum. Typed orders were stamped and signed. The language remained absolute. Must required no retreat. On paper, order still existed, but beyond those thick concrete walls, order had long collapsed. These commands would not be remembered as strategic directives. but as evidence of the complete rupture between authority and reality. Steiner was ordered to counterattack, a name repeated again and again as if saying it enough times could conjure an army from thin air. But Steiner had no troops to attack with. Not enough men, not enough weapons, not enough fuel to move. The order was sent, then disappeared into space, never becoming action. It existed as an echo cast into a void. Wenck was tasked with relieving Berlin. On the map, his arrow moved confidently toward the capital. But on the ground, Wenck saw what the men in the bunker didn't want to see. Refugee columns, shattered units, roads cut off. He realized the only meaningful mission left was not to save a condemned city, but to save the living. And so, silently, he altered the order. He opened an escape route westward toward the Americans. A disobedient act, but the final humanitarian gesture in a war that had lost all moral compass. In Berlin itself, orders to hold every district were issued with increasing desperation. The Volkssturm, old men and young boys, were told to fight to the last bullet. They weren't equipped to fight, only to die. Outdated rifles, a handful of bullets, and empty slogans about honor. Each neighborhood became a trap, a place where people were thrown not to change the outcome, but to delay the inevitable. The SS tried to enforce discipline through fear. Field executions were carried out behind the front lines, targeting those deemed cowards or deserters. But terror couldn't replace logistics. It didn't create ammunition. It didn't bring back fuel. It didn't resurrect destroyed divisions. Instead of strengthening the defense, it accelerated collapse, turning the army into fragmented groups who feared each other more than the enemy ahead. At this point, the High Command no longer commanded in any practical sense. It only produced paperwork. Orders were signed as ritual, not because anyone believed they'd be executed, but because not signing them would mean admitting collapse. It was the final method of preserving the illusion that someone was still in control, that the war was still being directed, not simply dying in chaos. At the mid-level, many officers clearly understood the absurdity of the orders they were receiving, and they began doing the only thing their conscience still allowed: delaying, softening, reinterpreting. An order to counterattack immediately became prepare the forces. A command to hold at all costs was relayed as withdraw in an orderly fashion if necessary. This wasn't open rebellion, but quiet resistance, an effort to reduce pointless death. In these final days, the war no longer resembled a military confrontation, but an administrative tragedy. Paper moved faster than people. Decisions came quicker than action could follow. The gap between command and reality had grown so vast, no bridge could span it. And in that void, tens of thousands died, not for strategy, but for momentum. Berlin was fractured block by block, each block splintered into isolated pockets of resistance. There was no real coordination, no big picture. Each man fought or didn't based on his own personal will to survive. Orders from the bunker meant little by the time they reached the street. And then, amid all the orders that could not be fulfilled, a silence began to take shape. Not a sudden silence, but a tired one. Meetings grew shorter, discussions faded, no one tried to persuade anyone anymore. The people inside the bunker understood. They were living in the drawn-out ending of a story that had already concluded. Hitler continued to sign orders, he continued to name units, he continued to speak of counterattacks, but his words no longer stirred emotion. They passed through the room like echoes in a cave. The people around him listened, noted, and left, carrying the sense that everything had become performative. After the truth had been spoken and rejected, the system no longer had the strength to argue with it. It simply fell silent and continued running until it no longer could. Orders that could not be carried out became the background rhythm of the Third Reich's final days. And within that meaningless repetition, a new atmosphere took hold in the Führerbunker, the silence after the truth. There were no more explosive outbursts, no more confrontations, only emptiness, a space where everyone knew what was coming, but no one had the strength or reason to stop it. It was the silence of people who had gone to the end of illusion, touched the truth, and realized that even speaking it wasn't enough to save a system that had rotted to its core. And in that silence, the end was no longer a question of if, only when. The silence didn't crash into the Führerbunker like a sudden collapse. It spread slowly, seeping into every crevice of that cramped space. It didn't need to be announced. No one had to command it. After the night the truth was spoken, there was nothing left to argue about. Everyone knew the war was over in practice. Only the corpse of it still twitched from leftover momentum. In those final days, the bunker no longer resembled a command center. It had become a refuge for people emotionally hollowed out. Meetings still took place, but they were short, scattered, stripped of purpose. No more large maps laid out with urgency. No more arrows drawn with conviction that they represented a future. Everything shrank, in space and in spirit. Hitler appeared less and less, and when he did, the room no longer tightened with tension. It sank into something else, fatigue. His rages gave way to long silences. He spoke, but his voice had lost its weight. Orders were issued out of habit, not belief, because he no longer knew what else to do. The people around him changed too. They no longer tried to persuade, no longer debated, no longer objected. Each retreated inward, facing a question they'd avoided for years of war. What have I helped build? The sound of artillery outside Berlin still echoed, but no longer startled anyone. It had become a background rhythm to life in the bunker, like the steady fall of rain outside a shuttered house. Each explosion was a reminder that the world above was still moving, regardless of what lay buried beneath. This silence wasn't just the absence of words, it was the absence of hope. No one spoke of victory. No one asked if the tide could turn. The only question left, though unspoken, was how each person would end their part in this story. Survive, surrender, or die with the system they had served. In the narrow hallways, conversations were brief and soft. Not about the war, but about distant things. A memory, a family, a city that once stood before the bombs. Not nostalgia, but a final attempt to hold on to the sense that they had once been human. Not just cogs in a machine of destruction. Some chose to end things in absolute silence. They withdrew into their rooms, closed their doors, avoided contact. Their eyes were empty, no longer searching for what came next. For them, the truth had already been spoken, and there was no longer any reason to pretend. Others waited. They knew the end was coming, but didn't know when. Each hour dragged, yet passed too quickly. Time in the bunker lost all rhythm, stretching and warping as if it too didn't know how to conclude. That silence carried a deeper fear, the fear of what came after. When the war ended, there would be no bunker to hide in. No more orders to shield behind, only bare, individual men, exposed before history, before judgment, before their own conscience. For many, that was more terrifying than death. And in that space, death began to arrive, quietly. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the silent decisions made after too many sleepless nights. Not all were escapes. For some, it was the only remaining way to reclaim a sliver of control in a life consumed by power and war. When Hitler took his own life, the bunker did not erupt into chaos, as some might imagine. There were no screams, no panic. The news spread in silence, accepted like a long-expected conclusion. For many, it was not a shock, but confirmation. It was truly over. What followed was a hollow stretch of hours. No more center of power. No one left to give orders. Just individuals standing in what had once been called the heart of the Third Reich. The bunker was no longer a symbol of command. It was a living monument to collapse. The silence after the truth wasn't liberating. It didn't lift the weight of the past. It only created a void, a space where illusion had vanished and nothing yet had taken its place. In that void, people were forced to look directly at what had happened. Not through slogans, not through maps, not through commands. And it was in that silence that history began its work. Not with trials, not yet, but with memory. Memory of truths spoken too late. Of orders that could never be carried out. Of a system that destroyed itself because it could not allow truth to exist. Berlin did not fall only to bombs. It fell because of silence. Silence that lasted too long before anyone dared to speak the truth. And when the truth finally was spoken, the silence that remained was not peace, but a cold reminder that in certain moments of history, if people do not confront reality in time, the cost will exceed any military defeat. It was a silence that needed no conclusion, a silence that let history speak for itself. As this story draws to a close, what lingers is not the final artillery shell that fell on Berlin, nor the image of an empire crumbling into ashes. What remains is a quiet, persistent question. What truly destroyed the Third Reich? Not just the military strength of its enemies, not just strategic failures, but something deeply human. The moment when truth was forbidden for so long that by the time it was finally spoken, there was nothing left to save. The night the generals told Hitler, "We have lost," was not a night of betrayal. It was a final, desperate rise of reason in a system built on illusion and fear. But history rarely offers second chances. When power refuses to accept reality, all talent, all loyalty, all sacrifice becomes meaningless. Not because people lacked courage, but because they were forced into silence for far too long. This story doesn't belong only to Germany in 1945. It's a timeless warning. Any system that treats truth as a threat and truth-tellers as enemies will sooner or later drive itself to the edge. And when that moment comes, the cost is not just defeat, but total destruction of people, of ethics, of memory itself. History does not exist to condemn easily, but it also does not exist to comfort. It exists to remind us that there are moments when telling the truth may not change the outcome, but staying silent will surely make the ending far more brutal. To remind us that the greatest power does not lie in giving orders, but in being able to listen when reality still has time to speak. If you've stayed with us until the final moments of this story, if you've felt the weight of those moments when individuals stood between truth and survival, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe caused the truth to arrive too late? And what lesson from this history still matters in today's world? And if you believe that history is not just dates and battles, but human stories that must be told slowly, honestly, and without flinching, subscribe to History War. There, we'll continue to walk with you through the defining moments of history, where truth, even when painful, still deserves to be heard.